Hi, this is the part two of home, and I want to discuss in this section more about the fine tuning that goes on in the creation by God of our home, of the planet Earth, and the specialness of that creation. What happens is that fine tuning, I need to describe it a little bit. You know, when the scientists first looked at the idea that there was a Big Bang theory as opposed to the steady state, they didn't want to accept the Big Bang, partly because of cause and effect. And if you had a beginning of something, you needed something that started it or was the beginner of that. And they didn't want to acknowledge that it took a starter to start the whole process of creation of the universe. In the same way, fine tuning is a hard thing for scientists to accept because they do not want to acknowledge the existence of a fine tuner. It requires a tuner to do this type of tuning. One of the ways to try to explain what this really means is that there was an article recently out in Scientific America, and it's quoted their idea or the beginning of their theory was that there's an extremely low probability or exceedingly low probability that two massive black holes would merge and cause these things called gravitational waves. And so they said because it's such exceedingly low probability, it is thus reasonable. And then they go on and describe their theory of what they call primordial black holes. But the whole idea is that exceedingly low probability and reasonableness fits into this discussion of fine tuning, because what I want to talk about is the reasonableness that fine tuning can only exist when you take into account that God is that tuner and creation is not probable at all. Fine tuning goes along many different areas, but I'll start out with what we call the physical constants that are involved in fine tuning. These are what the astrophysics and the physicists have come up with. And if we were to look at their numbers, we would find out that the exactness for the creation or for the existence of the universe, the existence of matter, therefore the existence of Earth and life, is so exceedingly fine-tuned that it's totally improbable. There's no reasonable explanation that they can come up with. If you were to take a deck of cards and cut those cards, you have a 1 in 52 chance of getting the ace of spades. If you were to say what is the probability of us existing and life existing, our probability would be 1 over 1,000 trillion. I mean, the numbers are ridiculous. For instance, some of the ones that they look at are the ratio of the protons to electrons, or the cosmological constant, or the numbers for electromagnetic force or gravitational force. These numbers are so precise and fine-tuned that they really cannot exist in the sense that they're just perfect. And if they were just changed by a little bit, none of us or nothing could exist. If you look at it in terms of the Big Bang, it would be sort of like, how can God create a Big Bang with the pertinent energy to envision that there would be a planet Earth existing billions of years later? You know, and the energy and the force that went into that Big Bang has to be that exact. That's what fine tuning is about. When we look at the idea of the astrophysics fine tuning, we basically have to ask a lot of questions because, you know, I looked at some of the, what do they call it, the Big Bang steps or timeline, and there's something like 15 different timelines. The first 6 take place before a second even passes. But within that timeline, you have to understand that everything has to come into existence. And one of the things that they have really wondered about is why is there more matter than antimatter? They're basically produced simultaneously by some special force which they don't understand also. But there has to be more matter than antimatter. If there wasn't, then we wouldn't exist, because matter would not exist. The antimatter and matter would come together, and they would destroy each other, so they wouldn't exist. Recently, I think well, maybe even yesterday or the day before, they came out with an article where they discovered that there are more neutrinos than there are antineutrinos that are developed when you do these big collisions of things, I guess. On what it means is that they said there's an asymmetry that exists, and it's the first time they're able to look at that and see that it exists. We know it exists because we know we exist. Some of that anthropic principle that I talked about before, but that is basically part of the reasoning. And there's a thing that I need to go back on a little bit to explain why this home is so important. I talked to you about the personalization of God, but I know from reading the Bible how special man is. I know by understanding who we are and what we are, I know how special man is also. The human beings are very special on this earth and in creation. But the idea of a special planet and a special home that God created for us is a very personal thing, and it's a bit different from me spending my whole life reading science and wanting to understand science, and really realizing that a God created all of this, and a God that had to be so intelligent and have so much power that he could create this complexity and design this complexity that exists in all of creation, as we are discovering. Our limited brains are picking up more and more pieces of that discovery. But the whole idea of that brings me to the process that I cannot believe anything reasonably except that God did create all of that. But a home is much more personal. It tells you that we have not only been created special, but our home has been created special also. And this fine tuning has a lot to do with it. The other part about the fine tuning is, we got more matter than antimatter. But we also have to look at the idea that everything, every part of everything that exists is created specially, and it is specially fine tuned. We can make a car, we can take iron ore and mix it with a carbon alloy and make steel and use that steel to make a car. But God made all of these components, during this process of the Big Bang, or maybe some other method, we're not sure. But he basically started out with helium, hydrogen, and maybe a little bit of lithium. And those were the components that condensed to make stars. Inside the stars, you had to have a lot of force, gravity, and you had to have a lot of heat to cause nuclear fusion, which created all these heavier elements that exist. So the heavier elements, everything, your silicon, your carbon, everything that's more complex existed inside these stars. But they had to be distributed throughout the whole universe. And this occurred through these supernova that that you might have read about. They're happening all the time. But that's what exploded. A star exploded, and in that process spread out all these other elements, these heavier elements throughout the whole universe. They became stardust. And if you've seen some of these pictures by Hubble, one of the great ones is the Ego Nebula. That's what the stardust is called, nebula. And inside those nebula, you reform new stars. And these new stars have some of these components, but they also create nuclear fusion, and they explode. And they're basically exploding, and the whole stardust is basically made up of all of these really important elements that are important to our life. And it becomes really not just a matter of, wow, now they're available. I've heard that our sun might be one of the fourth generation of stars exploding, compressing, condensing, exploding again, and But we have to actually have within our solar system and our sun the pretty much correct ratio of elements that would make life possible or probable. And so we are carbon based animals, or all life is carbon based, it seems, and DNA is carbon based, and those things have to be perfect. So if you want to talk about how fine tuning is taking place, you have to understand that this type of thing is part of the thing that God is doing to make everything just right for us. And there are many other components that I wanted to get into, and I'm taking way too long on this, so I'm going to have to break this into other sections. Thank you.